Go into your plenary lecture.
Otherwise,
And the
Yes. Yeah, like that so I can see your face as well. Okay.
should I take the glasses off?
No, however you're comfortable.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm ready, so.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Tissa. I'm a neurologist and current co-chair of Public Awareness and Advocacy. And I'm delighted to present my friend, colleague, Associate Professor Hadi Manji, whom I knew for well over 10 years now from World Congresses. Professor Manji, how are you?
Yeah, I'm very well, thanks. I'm very pleased to be here in Montreal for this Congress, really, because since COVID, this is probably the first major conference that I've been to. So it's been exciting to see everyone from all around the world, and I was very honored to be asked by Wolfgang and Matthew to give one of the plenary lectures which I gave this morning. And the title they sent me was The Neurology of Pandemics, which is a very exciting title, partly because my career has been bookended by two pandemics. When I qualified in 1981, it was the HIV/AIDS pandemic started, and now, as I'm coming to the end of my career, it's the COVID-19 pandemic. And I could have retired at the age of 60, but I'm glad I didn't, because I'd have missed out the excitement of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'd rather be a bit player rather than a bystander. And so one of the things that happened as a result of the COVID pandemic is that we used to have a once-monthly meeting of encephalitis discussions.
Mm-hmm.
Once COVID started, the number of referrals we got escalated a huge amount. And we then had to have a weekly meeting, which we had about 100 people online with neurologists, neuroradiologists, neurovirologists, because people didn't quite know what to do with some of these brain complications we were seeing.
Now, I'll stop you there,
Yeah.
because you were part of the AIDS pandemic also. Were you surprised that despite people like Stephen Kent and others writing in 1970s that every infection caused brain involvement with cytokine production and rest of the other things, while world knew that, why do you think that they were surprised to see that brain involvement was occurring with COVID-19, which they should have expected?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was an inkling from the other coronavirus epidemics, SARS in 2003, MERS in 2009, where there were reports of neurological complications, Guillain-Barré syndrome, last vagal stroke. But the numbers were small. So 9,000 people with SARS, 3,500 with MERS. But there was that inkling. So when the first reports came out from Wuhan in 2020, the paper documented 36% of inpatients had neurological symptoms or syndromes. And these were stroke, headache, coma, seizures, but it wasn't clear from those first papers whether this was due to the virus itself. Was it due to hypoxia or sepsis?
Or hyperinflammation?
Or hyperinflation, although that was never really, didn't come on the cards right at the beginning. It took a while to get that. And so people then eventually latched onto the fact that, that the virus is actually triggering off a hyperimmune system. Because the unusual thing about COVID was, there were some people who had SARS-CoV-2 infection but didn't know about it. And then the other group who died of it. That was a disparity. And you couldn't predict quite who was going to do what.
Mm-hmm.
So there were some people who were fit and healthy, but they still died. And it was the hyperimmune system which was overplaying the role, really. So it may be that they knew about these hyperinflammatory syndromes, but I think it was all hidden aside and people have forgotten about it.
I would assume so. I think you would agree with me that the infectious burden or impact of infections were neglected. This is not a criticism by our colleagues, probably including us also being complacent. Given that you did this successful plenary lecture, you and me both aware that long COVID was a term coined by patients themselves. At the very early onset of pandemic, our group redefined this as post-COVID-19 neurological syndrome. Tell us about the current status of long COVID or post-COVID condition, or whatever the term that you prefer to use, what's the sort of percentage of people that we are talking about or estimating about, and where the future is heading, where the researchers and researchers and clinicians and people with lived condition should concentrate on?
So, I mean, I think long COVID, I use the phrase long COVID because it's going to be a major problem. There are 65 million people in the world labeled as having long COVID. In the UK, we have 2 million people diagnosed with long COVID.
And real number is probably 5 or 6 times higher than that.
And in the BMJ, in the last 2 weeks, there's been an article about doctors whose lives have been destroyed by long COVID. They were doing their work, they've got COVID, and now, because of long COVID, they can't work, they've lost their houses, and they don't have enough money and things. And there's a big issue about, what should we be doing about these doctors who've got long COVID. So the numbers are going to be huge. The problem,
so we need to find solutions soon.
Yeah, the problem is that at the present time, we're not really clear about the mechanisms of long COVID. Is it viral persistence? Is it reactivation of EBV or HSV6? Is it related to autoimmunity? Because no doubt with post-COVID, there's an increase of immune-mediated disorders. There's some theory about vasculopathies and coagulation problems. And there's also suggested that maybe there is a sort of functional disturbance within the brain stem and the vagus nerve. So one of the lectures I went to yesterday was with Arvindra Nath, who talked about some of the patients they did post-mortems on, young people who died suddenly for no obvious cause. And at post-mortem, what he found was that part of the brain stem had neuronophagia cells, the cells that died in that part of the brain stem responsible for respiration. And he calls it an Onidine curse. And certainly, when COVID first started, I remember there was this phrase called happy hypoxia. So people were hypoxic, but didn't realize they were hypoxic. And those are the sort of people who died. So just sort of coming back to it, so those are the sort of postulated mechanisms. Nothing's been proven. The treatments at the moment are all anecdotal because patients are desperate. I've had patients who've flown off to Germany for plasmapheresis. Some doctors have tried them on H1H2 blockers, but nothing's been proven. It's all very anecdotal. And I think you're right. It is almost a sense of urgency that we need to find out the mechanisms and produce some treatment options, because I think this group of patients overlaps very much with the chronic fatigue ME patients. And a lot of research has been done in that group of patients, which people have perhaps ignored or not really paid much attention to and swept it under the carpet. So I think, a bit like the AIDS pandemic, the agenda for AIDS research was driven by the patients. They were articulate, they were young, and with COVID as well, I don't know what your experience is, but they tend to be quite young, relatively young people who are articulate, and they'll be driving that agenda. In my experience, the older patients who may suffer with symptoms probably don't complain of them because they're glad to be alive more than anything. The young people who led busy lives, exercised, worked very hard, they're the ones who are struggling to cope with the symptoms and how to manage them.
The concept called brain fog and not being able to work is a sort of recurring issue or the theme from these groups. And hopefully we would see some clinical trials and some solutions being tested sooner rather than later. Let's change the topic to other things. Where else have you been today and yesterday? What were the interesting topics that you picked up that you wanted to share your thoughts to our viewers?
Yeah, so the highlight, yesterday I went to Eva Feldman's talk about the global burden of diabetic neuropathy. And she gave an excellent lecture, and the outstanding sort of startling facts were the numbers of how much the prevalence of diabetes has increased in Africa by 136%, in Middle East 80%, Australasia, from your part of the world, 26%. So the diabetic prevalence is increased a huge amount. And the other sort of important aspect about diabetic peripheral neuropathy was that it's not just enough to control the blood sugars, which is your first tendency, but the whole metabolic syndrome, hypertension, triglycerides, lipids, all need to be controlled in order to reduce the incidence and prevalence of diabetic neuropathy and therefore foot ulcers. And apart from that, diet is so important, which I didn't realize. So one of the interesting facts she came up with is that in high-income countries, energy intake is usually fat predominant.
Mm-hmm.
But in the low-income countries, where diabetes is also a problem, the energy intake is carbohydrate. And both of them are bad.
Mm-hmm.
And so she emphasized that the diet needs to be controlled with monosaturated fats or polyunsaturated fats or the ketogenic diet. So diet is really important in the management of diabetic neuropathy and therefore diabetic foot ulcers. So I thought that was really important. That I suppose the other way we're talking about is that there has to be a holistic approach to patients, not just the blood sugars. You need to look at their blood pressures, their lipids, the diet, and exercise was another aspect which is underrated in terms of helping managing diabetic neuropathy. So I thought that was a very good session that she gave.
Brilliant. And sort of these were all encompassing this holistic brain health that we have been hearing as a recurring theme in many sessions. What else that you could think of the quality time that you spent at the Congress today and yesterday?
So the other, which I think was a very moving one, was by Miss Oliver, who was the patient advocacy about brain tumors. She gave a very moving account of her son who died of a brain tumor, and she set up this brain tumor advocacy group, which seems to be very successful, and it's a global project supporting patients and families with brain tumors, disseminating literature about that, raising funds for that. So that was quite a moving session she gave after my plenary session.
Brilliant. I'm glad that you mentioned this the patient and advocacy term here. We heard from Valerie Fagin today that there are about 3 billion people living with the brain disorders at this point of time, meaning that the impact of brain disorders are upon all of us, the 8 billion people, because we are social animals. You have your social network, I have our my social network, our camera crew have their social networks. So if 3 billion people are affected with brain conditions, because of the connections, all 8 billion people are impacted upon it. I guess if we were to promote brain health, we need to mobilize at least portion of those groups. I'm glad that you enjoyed that moving story from the patient. Any other notable things that you could think of?
So the Professor Fagin's talk about the global burden of diseases, again, stark that 4 in 10 people in the whole world has some sort of neurological problem. And the 3 commonest causes of...
Almost like 1 in 2.
Yeah. The commonest cause of dailies, so that's a combination of mortality and morbidity, were stroke, neonatal encephalopathy, and migraine. Those are the big 3. And neurological disorders are the commonest cause of death and morbidity compared to all other diseases. Second most common cause of death after presumably cardiovascular disease. And I think he quite rightly said that, neurological disorders need to take a priority as an emergency in global health because of all the numbers of people that have been affected. And the problem is that the majority of the dailies are in low to middle income countries around the world, which is where all the problems lie.
To make matters even more complicated, and given the difficult situation that our world is in right now, whichever the region that you are in, it just shows you that even without a brain disorder, how the human brain health and decision-making process and collaborating, coordinating, and helping each other is of huge importance, isn't it?
And also, I think COVID had a huge impact in terms of for example, even AIDS prevention, AIDS preventive techniques, that all really went to one side because of COVID, you know. But, you know, there are positive things that are coming on. It's not all depression, because one of the things I did want to mention was infectious diseases. So during the COVID pandemic, more children died in Africa of malaria than of COVID. And one of the highlights that's come up is there's now a new malaria vaccine from the Jenner Institute in Oxford, which is 75% protective, and have just started rolling it out in sub-Saharan Africa. So, you know, there are sort of good bits as well. It's not all depression and all negative. So, you know, I think that is going to be a good way forward.
100%. I think two of us catching up with each other after 2017 World Congress, saying hello to each other physically, cannot be matched with the virtual contact, isn't it? So that being here, being on site, I'm not disregarding that the seeing things and accessing things virtually is a bad thing. That's a great thing also. But being here is a good thing also. Any closing remarks?
So, I mean, I think the progress in neurology is astronomical. You know, I think that when I was a junior doctor, you know, consultants would say, oh, you're going to be doing neurology. Neurologists are elephantine in their diagnostic skills, but rather murine in their therapeutic skills. You know, that has changed over the time that since I qualified. So that now stroke treatments changed completely. It's hugely effective. MS treatments are remarkably changed. The areas which have not changed...
Headache treatment also.
Exactly. The areas which have not changed are motor neuron disease. You know, Parkinson's disease still is not curable. We're on the cusp of Alzheimer's disease. You know, I think it's nearly there with all the new monoclonal antibody type treatments. And, you know, who would have thought we could have treatments for genetic neurological disorders?
Like spinal muscular
atrophy, familial amyloid polyneuropathy. Unbelievable. And I think the whole next generation is going to be about treatment of genetic neurological disorders. That's where I tell the young doctors to be focusing on. If they're looking for areas of research, it's going to be the treatment of neurogenetic disorders.
Thank you very much for joining us today. And the friends, that's all from us today. Hope to catch up with you tomorrow with yet another edition, and enjoy the conference so far. If you're not here physically this time, make sure that you mark your diary for the next Congress in 2 years' time in beautiful Seoul, Korea, and make sure that you pack your bags or plan to be physically there, as there's more fun being here physically, face to face. And I look forward to seeing you also.
See you in Seoul. Thank you.